You found the skeleton. How would you calculate that distance? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Alrighty, well, hello everyone, and welcome back. This is part 2 of our The Process of Evolution with Dapper Dinosaur.
Yep, that's right. That's me.
That is he, and a link to his channel should be in the description. Should ye want to go check out his material, which you absolutely should, because he produces great content.
Thank you, thank you. This is part 2 of 40, right?
Maybe. I mean, there's enough material within the field of evolutionary biology to make like a 40-part series.
Here's our goal. We're going to read every paper that references evolution that has been published since papers started being published.
I have to interrupt. The correct answer is 42.
Ah, there you go. This 42. Is part 2 of 42. 40 to go.
There we go. In actuality, we'll probably get through the rest of the process itself today, and then next Thursday we will cover the evidence that evolution has been occurring in the past. And so if you haven't seen the first part, go watch that. Dapper and I discussed predominantly how variations arise within populations via mutations and recombination, and we discussed the first part of natural selection, really just the bare bones basics of natural selection, how it contributes to the formation of adaptations. All right, and without further ado, we'll move on to we will get back to where we left off, which was with coevolution. So, does it need to be full screen, or is that fine?
It is full screen on the YouTube feed.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Okay, so coevolution. There we go. Okay. So we're still talking in a sense sort of about evolutionary arms races, but instead of these being where organisms are antagonistic against each other, as we mentioned last time, the gazelle and the cheetah. Cheetah's trying to eat the gazelle is trying to escape, or the cuckoos and the various birds that they parasitize. These are beneficial relationships. These organisms are evolving in tandem, but to each other's benefit. So one has mutations or variations, and then this causes selective changes in the other species, which then causes selective changes in the former, and so on and so forth. So they enter mutually beneficial relationships with each other, wherein each provides the other with something. Flowers have mutualisms with butterflies, beetles, flies, and hummingbirds. The flower provides nectar in exchange for the animal transporting its pollen. Probably everyone's familiar with those examples. Some corals have a symbiotic relationship with dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates are a type of algae, quote, because algae is not a monophyletic term. It's very polyphyletic. And so you can see those little green specks in that soft coral, or what looks like a soft coral. Those are dinoflagellates. So they are dinoflagellates are members of the SAR group, or the Chromista. So their ancestors engulfed a red algae after the origin of the chloroplast. So it's like a Matryoshka doll. You have the chloroplast, which is probably related to like Prochlorococcus or one of the other cyanobacteria, which is itself inside a green algae, which is itself inside which is in a red algae, which is inside
in an idarian,
in a chromist inside an idarian.
Oh, right.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like the animal version of lichen. Because lichen is a photosynthetic organism inside of a fungus.
Exactly right. Sorry about that.
There you go.
Okay. Lichens are interesting because it was thought that it was just like one algae and one fungus, but it turns out that it's probably multiple fungi and perhaps multiple algae, and also there's some bacteria in there which are also contributing to this relationship. There's just a whole bunch of stuff all going on.
It's basically a party for microbes.
It is absolutely a party for microbes. All right, next slide, please. All right, some more examples. So that's a bee orchid, and doesn't he just look so cute? I just love the bee orchid. Adorable.
It is adorable.
So not only is this giving off, it's not only giving off, floral scent as flowers are wont to do, and it's not just giving off the sort of normal bright petal colors, because blue flowers are usually pollinated by bees, but also it's even evolved to look like a bee, so it's going all out to get the attention of bees. Bees would try to mate with it and accidentally pick up the pollen, and then off they go. So, and then with the other one, those are it's both orchids. I just happened to pick orchids. I didn't choose them on purpose. It was just the ones that came to my mind first. But sexually deceptive orchids. So these are both male wasps, and the flowers smell like female wasps. But you can see it's not a very pretty flower. It doesn't have these big bright petals like the bee orchid does, and so probably under other circumstances the wasps wouldn't come to these flowers, but here they are.
They're lucky, and they're going to be sorely disappointed.
Yep, they kind of walk around, check it out, and they're like, "Hey, there are no women here. Off we go, I guess." And then they fly away.
And for the flower, hopefully land on a different flower that also catfishes them.
Exactly. Yep, getting flower fished, flower wasped.
When you're a wasp, it happens. It's just one of those things.
It's just one of those things. Yeah. Next slide, please. And continuing onward. So we haven't talked about speciation yet. We'll get there in a little bit, but this was actually a paper I got to see discussed in person when I was at LSU. The one of the authors, I don't remember which one it was Sattler or Karstens, but this person came to LSU and gave the lecture on this paper, and it has stuck with me ever since. That was 5 years ago. It was just such a fascinating paper. So in essence, what happened is this pitcher plant, which is Sarraceniae, dispersed west across the Mississippi River, because it's a rather old river. It's been around for 18 million years, something like that. It's a pretty long time. But there are flies and moths and other arthropods associated with these pitcher plants. And what the researchers found was the pitcher plants on the west side were in a novel environment, and so they speciated. And as they were in the process of speciating, the arthropods associated with them also speciated.
Nice.
So, because these pitcher plants are the home for these various arthropods. So I just thought that was an absolutely fascinating paper.
It's really fascinating, and it makes sense. Once you establish this coevolution as one group involved in the coevolution starts to speciate, the other side of that symbiotic relationship is going to have to adapt to the new situation, and so they're going to probably end up speciating too. So it's one of those things where it's like, it's really cool, and then when you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, it kind of has to be that way, huh?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's just something I find to be really neat. So, all right, next slide, please. All right,
Jackson's favorite arthropod.
I mean, it basically is now. Well, I mean, there's also Phineas vindex, but we won't talk about that guy here. Up to this point, we have talked about natural selection. We talked about adaptations, sort of in the sense of one-off adaptations. And then we carried that a bit further with our evolutionary arms races idea. You have these antagonistic arms races where two species are trying to outcompete each other, or one's trying to eat the other, or something like that. Or where two species are evolving beneficially in tandem for for each other's benefit. And so the question that logically in my mind arises is, how far can this process go? And that's where you come to the idea of complexity gradients. Because for most features among organisms, there is a gradient of these features. It's not simply they're there and then they're not there, or vice versa. And so one thing you have to understand about these complexity gradients, and something, the famous I quote that creationists love to throw out from Origin of Species, literally the very next sentence says, but if every generation, every variation within each generation is heritable and is beneficial to its host, then those structures will just keep evolving. There's no reason for that evolution to stop. And so we already talked about one example of that. We talked about the example of the sharp-nosed pufferfish. If you guys will remember, if you don't, go watch the last video, where these researchers showed that looking progressively more like a pufferfish, like a sharp-nosed pufferfish, Canthogaster valentini, confers slightly more protection from predators like wrasses and groupers. And that's exactly the point. Every stage, every step has to be adaptively beneficial. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of there's kind of a misunderstanding about this in some circles, that structures are non-functional or they're deleterious until they become functional. And that's just not how evolution works.
Yeah, I've often heard people say things like, well, how do you evolve like a nervous system until when there's no like cardiovascular system to connect up to it? And then now that you get a cardiovascular system connected up, you still don't have a digestive tract. It's like, nope. None of that. That's not how any of this works. These are all things that are co-evolving. And when you start out very, very simple, you don't need a whole lot of this extra stuff. Like, you don't need a complex cardiovascular system. You just kind of need to be small and flat. And then you work up there. It's the same thing with things like the evolution of flight. You'll hear, what good is half a wing? Well, actually, it's pretty good. And that's foreshadowing.
Yes, it is foreshadowing. Maybe we'll talk about that in the next slide.
No way.
So here's another paper that this is one of my favorite papers of all time. Santos et al. 2017. So this is Ragavalia. Ragavalia is a member of the water strider family Velidae. And this guy has these little fans on his arms. You can see them down there by his third pair of legs. And those fans arose from a gene duplication. Researchers have sequenced his genes. They know exactly which gene was duplicated, which resulted in those fans. The original gene was called Mother of Geisha, and when it was duplicated, the duplicate copy was called Geisha.
Guess which one was named first?
Which one was named first?
I mean, Geisha, obviously.
Yeah, it was Geisha. And so the researchers figure this out, and it's the functioning of Geisha is pretty closely tied to the development of the fans. And so the researchers thought, wondered, well, what good is half of a fan? Does that provide any sort of movement boost at all? And it turns out, yeah, it does. When you knock out, or at least partially knock out, these fans, Ragavalia still has a movement boost over its close, I think it's like the sister genus, Stridulavalia. So Stridulavalia can't go upstream because it doesn't have these fans, but Ragavalia can. The fans are adaptively beneficial at all stages. You can have just half a fan, and you still move faster and can move upstream than Stridulavalia.
Yep. And moving upstream, I mean, for one of these, it's a pretty big advantage, because the thing is, these guys are, they're water striders, basically. So they're most able to survive hanging out on the surface of the water and jumping around there.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have to come on land, if you need to go upstream, that poses a pretty severe risk to you. Whereas if you can go upstream, just staying on the water, that's a pretty big advantage. It allows you to also colonize things much farther upstream than you otherwise would have. So, if a Stradulavelia population is relatively far downstream, there might be a great environment for them just, like a few kilometers upstream. Well, tough luck.
Right. Absolutely. So and that's why this is one of my favorite papers. I just love papers that partially knock out something or show how this thing evolved step by step, because there are lots of people who make arguments that, oh, such and such structure can't evolve in a step by step manner. Well, here are examples of things that can. So, all right, next slide, please. Whoa! How did Dapper know? That's what we were going to talk about.
Amazing.
I'll just let you. I'll just let you handle this one since you are the resident theropod.
All right. Well, first I want to talk about half a wing, and then we're going to get into more feather stuff, right? So you always hear, what good is half a wing? Well, the fact is that it's not just flying that can help animals. We know that because we have a lot of gliding animals today, like the colugo or flying lemur, the sugar glider, the flying squirrel. There's also even some frogs that manage to glide pretty well. There's a snake that managed to fly pretty well. Well, glide pretty well.
Nightmare fuel. Yeah.
Yes. There are the Draco lizards who fold out their ribs laterally into horrifying rib wings, and they glide pretty well. So gliding is a really advantageous thing, and here's the reason. It's because if you can get a good glide slope, then you can turn a fall into an actual event where you purposefully go from one place to another, whether it be to get to new food, to get access to new mates, or to escape danger, which are all reasons that animals might want to control their fall. And any animal can control its fall to some extent by using things like tail and arm and leg positions to, either increase the slope of the glide or to aim exactly for a landing place or whatever. You can just see this with cats, right? How come cats always fall on their feet? Well, because to some extent they can control their fall. And so if you get anything that helps you with this, whether it be a little flap of skin across the fingers or between the wrists and the ankles or from the wrists to the shoulder or anything like that, that can help increase how much lift you get. And from there, if you can start adding energy by means of, say, flapping, and you can extend the glide slope even farther. And once you can do that to the point where, and this is on a gradient, right? You go from being able to add essentially no energy after your initial leap into a little bit of energy from some weak flapping. And then eventually, if you can actually add energy at a pace equal to or greater than the pace at which you're losing energy as you fall, then you're now flying instead of gliding, because that's basically what the difference is between flight and gliding. And so we have a lot of animals that are at different stages of this that we can see, right? We have, like I said, like colugos, who have extensive webbing that's almost bat-like, which is one of the reasons why bats were once thought to be primates, because colugos were at the time were thought to be true primates too, and they thought there was actually a morphological link there because they have very similar, gliding and flight systems, as well as some other details of the skull, but that's not what we're here to talk about. But then we also get, well, what about birds? And we actually have a lot of animals with half a wing, basically. So we have things like, is that Sinosauropteryx in the middle?
Sinornithosaurus, yeah.
Sinornithosaurus. You know what? There's too many dinosaurs who just start with the word for China at the front of their name. Like, come on, guys, we get it. They're from China. So this is an animal that basically has a half a wing. So you can see that if you are familiar with how a bird wing anatomy looks, this is a very similar setup. So you have the thumb up there at the top, and you have the two fingers that are in very close association. This animal was actually extensively feathered. And then we go up to, say, like Microraptor up top or Archaeopteryx down bottom, where you actually have full flight feathers there, but their sternum isn't keeled, so they weren't flapping very hard. And so they also have sort of half a wing, although it's probably likely that at least Archaeopteryx could probably do power flight, Microraptor probably less so. And also, this also gets into something called exaptation. So if you look at the left, you have this gradient of feather evolution. We actually have examples of all of these steps in feather evolution in organisms that are either in the fossil record or extant. So, at the very end, we have several types of feathers now, like phyloplumes, down, and contour feathers, and primaries, secondaries, remiges, stuff like that. There's a lot of different kinds of feather. And so, and actually says Sinornithosaurus I should have just read it.
It's all right.
But anyway, so the first feathers were probably just there for the same reason hair is basic, or for the same reason hair really evolved, which is just thermoregulation. It's good to stay warm. Now, we always think of the Mesozoic as being a very hot time, and it was a lot warmer than it is today, although we're working on that apparently. But it still got cold, right? And even if it didn't get cold, it usually was still too cool to just incubate eggs out in the open all the time, because eggs need to be kept very warm. And so having feathers helps with this. And then even, thick veined feathers that are stiff also have probably some thermoregulation role, at least in brooding, because we have ornithomimosaurs who were not flying at all. We know that for sure. They definitely couldn't fly. But they were brooding their eggs the same way that modern birds do, which is to say they were sitting in the nest and covering them with the primaries and secondaries of their wings to help keep all that heat in. And that we actually have them preserved in the brooding posture in fossils. And we know they had to have feathers because not only do they have quill knobs, which is where the feather actually attaches down all the way to a bone for a very strong feather attachment, but also that position doesn't actually cover the eggs with anything unless there's feathers attached. And so you go from that, having these feathers for thermoregulation and eventually for brooding and for display, which necessitates these kind of strong, stiff, well-veined feathers. But then they're all pretty useful for extending glide slope because any long, flat thing can provide extra lift. And there you go. You're now off to the races to get powered flight.
Yeah. Excellent
So there
summary.
you go. Thank you.
All right. Next slide, please. This is also one that Dapper is familiar with.
Mm-hmm. We've definitely collaborated on many of these things.
We have. And that quote, this is the quote I was referring to by Darwin. This is the one that immediately follows the, what does he say? Like, to think that an eye, which is so perfect and can correct, chromatic aberrations and all this, to think it could have evolved by natural selection seems, ridiculous. But yet reason tells me that if numerous gradations from a perfect and complex eye to one very imperfect and simple, each grade being useful to its possessor, can be shown to exist, if further the eye does vary ever so slightly and the variations be inherited, which is certainly the case, and if any variation or modification in the organ be ever useful to an animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable by our imagination, can hardly be considered real. So, if we can find that gradations exist, and we can, and you'll see that in a moment, and if variations on the eye happen and can be inherited, and they are, and some of these are useful, and again, it's relatively easy to show, then the eye can evolve. Basically it, without all the semicolons and commas. Another example is the seahorses. Seahorses are very highly derived in their behavior and morphology, but most people don't know about all the pipefish that also exist. And pipefish fill in pretty much the whole morphological series from the more fishy, more regular looking like a fish, synathids, which are the seahorses and pipefish. And then you have like Solanostomus, which is that guy on the bottom. It's where it says closest relative of synathids. That's the ghost pipefish. And then you have your other pipefish. You have your pipefish without a brood pouch. Then you have pipefish with partial brood pouches, and then pipefish with full brood pouches. And actually, all of these still exist. You can find the whole series still out there because the radiation of seahorses occurred relatively recently in geologic terms.
But Jackson, if seahorses evolved from pipefish, then how come they're still pipefish?
Got me.
There you go.
Forced into early retirement.
Evolution destroyed.
Evolution 0. So this is just another example of the whole gradient existing. All right, next slide, please. Oh boy, I get to talk about plants. Woo! Everybody loves plants. So if you think about your life cycle as a spectrum, when you are haploid, which means having only half of your genetic material. And when you are diploid, having the full complement, there are two extremes. One extreme is called being gametic or diplontic, and the other extreme is called being zygotic or haplontic. And I'll, of course, explain what those mean. So animals and a few different types of algae, I think that's a brown algae up there in that picture, are what are called gametic. That means you are only haploid while you're a gamete, while you're a lonely little sex cell. That is the only time in our lives when we're haploid. The entire rest of our lives, from zygote onwards, we are diploid, except for the gametes that we produce, of course. And so pretty much the entirety of our life is spent in diploid mode. The opposite of that is zygotic. Zygotic means you are haploid. You only possess half the complement of chromosomes for pretty much your entire life cycle, with the sole exception of when you're a zygote. Hence why it's called zygotic. You are only diploid when you're a zygote. And then as soon as you're a zygote, you do meiosis, and then you become haploid again. Now, those are two extreme ends of the life cycle spectrum, but there are organisms that span that whole middle region, which is called having a sporic life cycle, where you are haploid for part of your life cycle, and then you are diploid for part of your life cycle.
Like a fern.
Well, like all plants, really.
Yeah.
Plants as a whole pretty much sit along the sporic spectrum from the mosses, your hornwort, your liverwort, your mosses on the one end, where you're much closer to a zygotic life cycle, and that's so you're predominantly haploid, or you are gametophyte dominant, if you want to be technical about it. And then from fern onto gymnosperms, which are the cone-bearing plants, and the angiosperms, the flower-bearing plants, you are sporophyte dominant, which means you are diploid for the majority of your life cycle. And so plants kind of sit along this whole little spectrum. We even have fossils of plants like a Cooksonia, which seem to have been about half and half. They're like right in the middle. Crazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially the entire spectrum exists. Oh, I forgot to say, predominantly protists are the ones that are zygotic, because it's live fast, die young, essentially. You're born, you have sex, you die. That's your whole life. So you don't need to produce any really complex structures or anything. You're just out there to get laid and then die. Whereas as you get increasingly complex with the plants, you become more and more and more diploid. And I think there are some orchids actually which are so close to gametic that they're practically gametic. Like they're just they're very close to our end of the spectrum in terms of the life cycle.
But what about hymenopterans?
They're still gametic. Oh, well, okay, I see what you're saying.
Oh, are they? Because their males are haploid.
They are still considered gametic, though. Just because you have a little haplodiploidy, which is an apomorphy within Hymenoptera. Not even all Hymenopterans. I think it's only in some of the Hymenopterans, right?
It's a bunch of them, so we'll just go with it.
Most of them, right? It's most Hymenopterans, probably. But this is just an apomorphy within this clade, because basically what happens is the males are haploid, where the females are diploid. And that's weird. And there were lots of hypotheses back in like the 70s about maybe this is why there's so much eusociality among hymenopterans, but that probably isn't the case. But regardless. So the point is simply here that you have these life cycles, and they span the whole spectrum from your more protist life cycle on the one hand, where you're only diploid for a little bit, to our sorts of life cycles where we're diploid pretty much in our entirety. And then, of course, on the other side, I had to include the eye, because this is one for which there's lots and lots and lots and lots of data. The you can go all the way from like simple proteins like rhodopsins, which change conformation based on how much light is in the environment, and like bacteria will do stuff like that. And of course, we have rhodopsins, which kick off what do you call them? I'm trying to think of the term of like phosphorylation pathways, basically. This protein will change its conformation, and then that will cause an enzyme to move a phosphate group to another enzyme, which will cause it to move a phosphate group to another enzyme, and so on and so on. And then that will get propagated as an electrical signal to your brain, right? That's very crudely how it happens. But not just for us. It happens for, pretty much all animals at different levels of complexity. Like you have sea stars and clams, which have just this little sort of cup. It's just like a little region with some photoreceptive cells, right? And they can only tell, is it light or is it dark? That's basically it. And then you can, if you're going towards the camera eye, for instance,
light or dark is all you
Yes.
need to set up a circadian rhythm. So if
That's
you have good
absolutely
reason
true.
to have different activities during the day or the night, well, then great. In fact, that's still how plants are basically working, right? Like they do things like
Yes.
they have these little pores on their leaves that open and close depending on the time of the day.
Mhm.
They tend to be open at night to bring in carbon dioxide so they can use it to grow. But also, when they're open, they tend to increase their water loss, which is why they open at night when
Mhm.
they're less likely to have water evaporate. And then as the day comes in, they'll close. And the same thing can be true for animals, right? Like maybe you're a coral, and you don't have a real eye, but the things you tend to suspension feed out of the water are more abundant, or they're moving around more during the day, so you become a little bit more active during the day. So even that tiny little just basic photoreception, is it light or dark, even that has adaptive function for many organisms that can't really see, quote unquote, even today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, being able to see like in any way is better than not seeing at all,
Yeah.
right? Being able to perceive your environment in some ways better than not being able to, just stumbling around in the dark. And then from there, if you just continue to sort of invaginate the tissue and cup the eye, or get closer and closer to sort of enclosing it, that increases your acuity, your vision acuity. And so this is like what nautiluses have. And so it's light hits at particular regions inside the eye, and this helps them figure out the direction of light. So now we're talking not just is it light or is it dark, it's we can see fuzzy objects basically.
Yep. This is a pinhole type eye, and you can
Mhm.
actually there's a thing that sometimes people do during solar eclipses, which is similar, which is you get a little piece of cardboard, right, and you puncture a tiny little hole through it, and then you can watch the eclipse safely through the hole, because the hole is getting all that light from the sun. Because it's so tiny, it can actually differentiate the direction of the sun much better than a wider aperture could, and so you can actually see the shape
Mhm.
of the sun, well, the apparent shape of the sun changing. And that's essentially what's happening. You're using this pinhole, which one reduces the brightness of the light that's incoming because not much of it can get through, which is a problem for organisms, but it's a feature of the pinhole solar eclipse observer, because you don't want to be blinded by the actual sun.
Mhm.
And two, it sharpens the image. And then the
Mhm.
next step is one of the ways that you can deal with the fact that you're greatly reducing the amount of light that you can take in. And that's our
Yeah.
next stage.
Yep. If you put a lens over your little pinhole, then that can help you further focus the incoming light, and now you have very high resolution vision as opposed to the low resolution of like nautiluses. And we have this type of vision, and also I say coleoids, which are octopus and squid they also have that type of eye. So they have really good vision, just like we do. The other the other side of that fork there, those are compound eyes. So compound eyes are pretty neat because it's basically a whole lot of repeats of like one type of cell. It's not like our eyes where you have like all the photoreceptors at the back and you have the lens at the front. Instead, with these, it's you pack lots and lots and lots of this one cell type, and that's how they perceive light. So, anything you want to add?
Compound eyes are cool and they're underrated. And also, trilobites use calcite as a lens, which is weird because it actually only directs light in one direction, which is, unlike most other lens types, which actually gather light from a range of angles. And so that's really weird. If you ever get a chance to like take some calcite and like some nice optically clear calcite, it's a very strange thing because like you can read right through it, like if you put it right on a book, but then if you lift it up or put it at a different angle, you can't see anything. It's very strange. And trilobites use it for eye lenses, which is just bizarre.
I think that had, I can't remember quite what that type of eye was called. If anybody remembers, put it into the chat, because there was a type of name for that eye. I cannot remember what it was.
Probably something that isn't just trilobite eye.
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank. Anyways, if someone knows what we're talking about, put it in the side chat.
Yeah, of course, not all trilobites had eyes.
That's true. Yeah, some of them were deep sea trilobites, and they just didn't have eyes at all. So
yeah, there's no light. What do you need an eye for?
Yeah, exactly. All right, next slide, please. Okay. At this point, we have been talking about how far natural selection can go, and we've really sort of talked about this abstractly, I guess. I mean, we provided examples, but now we're going to talk about how this applies in actual space over a particular geography. And for the first example, this is another orchid. Oh my goodness, what was I doing? Just having a fit over orchids, I guess.
I mean, they are really cool, and they show a lot of different adaptations to a lot of different things, so I get it.
They do. They are pretty cool, not going to lie. And they're very pretty. I do like orchids.
And there's one species where you can make a tea that changes color based on pH, which is neat, because then you can serve someone some tea and then ask if they want some lemon and then put the lemon in there and it changes the color of the tea.
That's pretty cool. I like that.
Yeah.
This guy is the orchid, the flower, not the moth, is Satyrian halakii, and as you can see, it is native to South Africa. Then that's a mountain range. It is running along there, along the coast.
But they kicked it out of Lesotho.
Yeah, they said not in our country.
No.
Only Lesothosaurus. And the cool thing about this flower is the depth of the flowers changes depending on what the pollinator is. So we're applying that evolutionary arms race concept across the geographic landscape. In the southern area of South Africa, you have short-tongued bees, and as a result, the flowers that they're able to pollinate have to have shallower flowers for them to be able to reach. Whereas in the north, the flowers are very deep because they are pollinated by hawk moths. And so you have these different selective pressures on these flowers across a geographic range, and it produces a range of phenotypes. So they're all within the same species, quote, quote, but they have different morphologies depending on their pollinator.
Species are fake, guys.
Species are fake. I said that in botany today.
Nice. Did your class riot?
No, they just kind of rolled their eyes and said, "Okay, can we go home now?" No.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Alrighty. Next slide, please. I forgot to add. Biogeography is probably my favorite field of evolutionary biology, simply because there is no model of biodiversity outside of evolution that accounts for biogeography and is parsimonious.
Or in
Doesn't
most
have
cases,
to-
even attempts to try.
Right? Yeah, because let's be real. The people who are not into evolution do not attempt to account for biogeographic distributions. They just say, "Meh, the organisms went there."
Well, I
That's
have
about
heard
it.
that maybe kangaroos rode a volcano blast to Australia,
Yeah, that sounds plausible. I would believe that.
which definitely results in perfectly healthy living kangaroos after being launched into space and then falling back to Earth, and definitely doesn't result in kangaroo salsa. And apparently, for some reason, marsupials are just super, super effective at riding volcano shockwaves through suborbital space flights.
It's kind of
Very,
amazing
very
that
impressive.
that marsupials can survive like volcanoes, but not mice. Like that's kind of interesting.
Or cats, for that matter.
Or cats, or dogs, or pigs, or foxes. Yeah, it's like, huh?
Yeah, those
That's
things
weird
just
how that works out.
destroy them. But volcano immune. They're basically like from the plane of fire. Indeed, they have really high fire resistance. So, pro tip: you can't
Right.
cook kangaroos. That's just impossible. Okay, sorry.
Yep, but so yeah, very very high fire resistance, but very low beast resistance, I guess.
Yeah, they take double damage from piercing attacks.
Oh god.
I
Biogeography.
can D&D anything.
That's you absolutely can. Yeah, this is true. So this is basically the example of biogeography which kind of kicked off the whole field, and that's the Galapagos, which are an archipelago, which is an archipelago near Ecuador, and Darwin,
Well,
of course,
near.
Near-ish. It's the
Yeah.
it's the closest thing, the closest mainland thing to the Galapagos is Ecuador. I'll say
True.
that. Which isn't by any means close. You probably wouldn't be able
No.
to swim it.
But you definitely wouldn't. I mean, it's also
Yeah.
not that much like closer than like Belize or Panama.
Right. Yeah. It's a substantial distance.
Yeah, it's really remote.
So Darwin circumnavigated the globe from 1831 to 36. It basically started like in December of 31, and it was on the HMS Beagle, which was captained by Robert Fitzroy, and there was a whole crew, and they went first to I think they made a stop in like one of those little islands in the Atlantic, but then after that they went to South America. I can't remember the names of those islands. So they went to South America, and Darwin found lots of fossils of Pleistocene mammals like Glyptodon and Megatherium and Cuvieronius, none of which had these names at that time, except I think Megatherium, and like Macrauchenia. And also fun side tangent on Macrauchenia before I get back to the Galapagos. There was a guy named Emigino, I believe was his name, who found a whole bunch of notoungulates, which we'll talk about in a moment. Actually, no, I'll just save the story for then, since we do bring these back up.
I mean, yeah, if we're going to bring up the notoungulata, we should bring it up later.
I just remembered that I have a slide on that. So the Galapagos. So of course Darwin and crew go around the tip of the Galapagos, which is the tip of South America, which is very cold because you're right next to Antarctica.
Mhm.
So
it's not called Tierra del Fuego because it's hot. It's called Tierra del Fuego because you have to keep a fire burning all the time, or you're going to freeze to death.
Right. Yeah. There are actually penguins down there, believe it or not. So then they go back up the other side. And there are actually penguins in the Galapagos too. They're the only equatorial penguins. So
I would rather be a Galapagos penguin than an Antarctica penguin.
I probably would too.
But then again, I purposefully moved to the hottest place outside of Death Valley that I could. So,
fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. So the Galapagos, there are several islands which have, which had, or, they're typically referred to by their Spanish names, but of course this was the 1800s and Darwin referred to them by their English names.
I mean, to be fair, he was an Englishman.
Exactly right, yeah. Though he spoke Spanish and French and like a little bit German, um, but yeah, he referred like the big island was Albemarle, whereas was it the Portuguese, I think, it's Isabela. So, and of course, Darwin is famous for the finches that aren't finches that he recorded on the islands. They're actually tanagers, which are related to finches. They're both passerine birds, but tanagers are in a different family. It's Thropidae rather than Fringillidae, which are the finches.
Okay, but passerine covers like a huge swath of birds. I'm pretty sure that's the majority of bird species.
I mean, that's probably true. So,
by the way, passerine birds are those songbirds, guys.
Yes, yeah, the song perching birds, right? So
if you see a bird and it's not like a parrot or a raptor or an ostrich or a duck or a chicken, like it's probably a passerine bird.
Yeah, which
is, like I said, most birds.
Right. Yeah, just the vast majority of birds. And so Darwin correctly reasoned, and highly recommend, if you haven't read it, read The Voyage of the Beagle. That's his notebook that he took with him.
Then read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Very different.
Just read Narnia in general. It's a good series.
It is also, yeah. Although I really never got into A Horse and His Boy. It was always weird to me. Anyway, sorry.
They were all weird to varying extents.
Well,
but
yes,
yeah, we're getting off topic.
True.
Anyway, so Darwin correctly reasoned, and he was sort of having these ideas kind of bubbling in his brain as he was on the Galapagos. He thought, maybe all these finches, quote quote, that I'm seeing here, which have different niches. Some of them eat seeds, and some eat nuts, some eat insects, some eat cacti, some actually drink the blood of the of the Nazca boobies. And actually, I think the blue-footed boobies are there too. These guys fill a lot of niches. He thought, what if they all came from one ancestral population who colonized the islands? And thanks to genetic testing, we know now that is absolutely the case. All the finches of the Galapagos, like Geospiza and Certhidia and Platyspiza, they're all members of the subfamily Geospizinae, which then, of course, nests within Thropidae. But they're all more closely related to each other on the Galapagos than they are to any of the birds, any of the tanagers of South America. But, surprise, surprise to no one, the closest relatives of the Galapagos tanagers are in Ecuador, like Tiaras, the dull-colored grassquit, which is that bird on the top left. And then one of the Galapagos tanagers is on the top right. But not only that, there are also tortoises on the Galapagos Islands, which vary from island to island based on the flora. So some have this saddle-shaped shell. And in fact, Darwin and other crew members attempted to ride the tortoises, but were unsuccessul. And what they found was that in areas with tall vegetation, there were these saddle... I feel like you're right. In areas with tall vegetation, these saddle shaped morphs lived, but in areas with low vegetation, they had the more sort of normal shaped shell, like that little Chaco tortoise on the left,
who's adorable. And
so that, he is pretty cute, and of course also native to Ecuador. So all these guys who are in the Galapagos, it's not just the tanagers and the tortoises, but also the iguanas and the different species of booby. They all got there via different, and of course all the plants all got there via different events, whether they were blown there from storms or rafted or what have you, and they ended up there and fill different niches now. And the Galapagos has only been around, I think, for about 5 million years, something like that, so not very long. These are all relatively recent evolutionary radiations.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Just that we can see the same kind of thing all over the place. So you get things like it doesn't just explain why, say, island species tend to be most closely related to nearby mainland species. It also explains things like why is it that we have completely different groups of animals filling the same niches, say, like I mentioned before, in Australia versus other places like Africa, and then again, say in South America, right? So South America has very similar. Many similar biomes to places in Africa and in Australia, but in those places you tend to get different groups filling the same niches, especially with Australia, and especially if you go like say before European contact with Australia. So you get things like thylacines, or even pre-human contact. You get things like Thylacoleo or Megalania, which was a marsupial first one, but Thylacoleo is sometimes called the marsupial lion because it was not quite as big as a lion, but was pretty big. And Megalania is basically, a gigantic lizard, probably the biggest non-aquatic lizard to ever live. And and then instead of deer, you get kangaroos and all these animals. And it's like, well, why? And the answer is because Australia, having been isolated for so long, it evolved its own set of animals to fill these niches, which still existed. And in that area, that's where there were a lot of marsupials, whereas in many other parts of the world were still connected or close enough together that rafting between them was very easy, you got a lot of placentals. But interestingly enough, in the fossil record of South America, you also get a lot of marsupials, as well as in Antarctica. Why? Because when the marsupials were undergoing their first radiation, South America, Antarctica, and Australia were all connected. And then you see through the geological record, as placental animals come in, it's when North and South America are getting close together or even connecting. And very few marsupials manage to survive to today from South America, except for those darn possums and relatives, which is why you have the opossum, the one and only native North American mammal. It came from South America. That's why its relatives are still in South America.
Yeah, absolutely.
Including a semi-aquatic species, which is fun.
Yep. All right. Next, please. So this is a picture most of you have probably seen. This is sort of a stylized version of a chart that Alfred Wegener came up with back in the early 1900s. He realized that the best way to explain the distribution of certain, these are all, I think, Permian fossil organisms. Or sorry, early Triassic.
Triassic, yeah.
Yeah.
I can see why you would think Permian, because there's a Lystrosaurus in there, and that's one of those synapsids that stretches across the Permian into the Triassic.
Right. Yeah. So, like early Triassic fossils, you have Glossopteris, which is a type of fern. Lystrosaurus, I think it's a mesosaur down there. And then Synagnathus, which is also a synapsid. That one, Synagnathus, is closer to us than Lystrosaurus is.
Yes, considerably.
But so he figured that correctly that the only thing which could account for this distribution is if these continents were connected. And we know he was right, or we know today he was right, but he didn't have a mechanism to explain how the continents could move. And so his ideas were not believed for a long time. He didn't have the data really to support it. It wasn't until much later that researchers figured out like what mid-ocean ridges are. I think that was in like the 40s with the development of like sonar technology for wartime stuff. So
thanks, World War One.
Right. Yeah. World War One, and as different countries are essentially scanning the deep ocean, they start to find these different geographic and geologic features, and this data starts kind of piling up, and researchers are like, it kind of seems like there are different plates maybe that the continents are on, and some are diverging and some are sliding under each other, and that's interesting.
Suddenly things like the Ring of Fire around the Pacific makes more sense, and why are there geothermal hot springs in some areas like Iceland and Greenland but not so much in others starts to make sense. And also before that, people basically thought that the bottom of the ocean outside the continental shelves was just sort of a smooth plain of like muck.
Yeah.
And it turns out, nope, it's not. I mean, it is in some places, but overall, no.
Right. It's mostly like basalt and that sort of stuff in the really deep ocean areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and
'cause
it's got mountains and valleys, and it's got its own geology going on down there.
Yeah. And so this distribution doesn't really make any sense on a non-old Earth, non-evolutionary model. There's really no way to account for this. But hey, guess what?
I feel like you're forgetting volcano shockwave surfing.
Oh, my bad.
Except for that, there's no other way to account for it.
Except for, yeah. Next slide, please. I totally forgot we had a marsupial slide in here. Dapper, you absolutely beat us to the punch on that. You beat.
Oh,
me to the
sorry.
punch.
Well,
No, it's okay. I mean, I'll just reference it in a moment. I also beat myself to the punch because I forgot I had a noto-ungulate thing on here. It's been a while since I opened this PowerPoint. So in the early Cenozoic, so the last 66 million years, some placental mammals made it to South America. Before South America, before that, in the Mesozoic, placental mammals made it to South America. Marsupials were already there. That's where modern marsupials originated, and some of them, as Dapper already said, crossed Antarctica, which was a prediction of evolution that if there are if there are marsupials in South America and also in Australia, then they would either have to be in Africa or in Antarctica. And it appeared based on the geologic data that Africa split off too early. So that left Antarctica. And lo and behold, researchers have found Antarctic marsupials dating to the late or the Eocene, I believe. So what a surprise. Whereas the noto-ungulates are a group of placental mammals, and I believe protein data has rooted them as near the perissodactyls, so the odd hoof mammals, which is kind of interesting. We have a few bits of proteins that researchers have managed to get off of fossils and sequence it, and it turns out it's close to that of rhinos, horses, and tapirs. So those are their closest living relatives.
Which makes them true ungulates, which was a debate for quite a while.
Right.
So there was the debate, does noto-ungulata convergently evolve the ungulate stance, and they're actually outside of crown ungulates, or are they somewhere within crown ungulates? And if so, where? And it turns out, they're slightly closer to Perissodactyla than they are to Artiodactyla.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the noto-ungulates, because South America became an island in the Mesozoic. It became an island, and it was an island for a pretty long time. For most of the Cenozoic, South America was separate from the other continents.
That's why you get weird things like noto-ungulates and fossoriacids.
Right. Yeah. You it wasn't until 3 million years ago, something like that, that the Isthmus of Panama formed.
Yeah, it was very, very recent, a few million years. Yeah.
Yeah, and the North and South America were finally able to exchange flora and fauna. So very recently,
and North America kind of dominated that exchange. Possums and armadillos are the only major animals that made it to North America and are extant to this day. Also, raccoons. Sorry.
Yeah.
Whereas
noto-ungulates, they didn't do so well.
Whereas jaguars, bears,
elephants,
all sorts of stuff went from North America into South America and just dominated. South America was kind of a disaster for them.
Cats, lots of cats. Because
canids, there's a whole bunch of native canids down there, like the short-eared dog, the bush dog, the
tapirs?
maned wolf. Yeah, tapirs, perissodactyls went down into there. Yeah, that exchange went poorly for native South American animals for the most part.
Yeah, lots of extinctions. Yeah, pretty much they wiped out the last of the noto-ungulates. Lots of marsupials went extinct.
It wasn't humans.
Yeah, but noto-ungulates
but once again, marsupials' Achilles heel, cats and dogs.
Right, not flames, cats and dogs.
Mm-hmm.
The weird thing about noto-ungulates is they evolved convergently to fill lots and lots of niches that other mammals fulfilled in other continents. So they were rabbit-like noto-ungulates, like Pachyrucus, which is weird. There were horse-like ungulates. There were sort of hippo-like notoungulates.
There was actually a lineage of notoungulates that was so horse-like that they actually evolved a single hoof
Yeah, the top turns.
morphology. Yeah.
Yeah, and that led Amagino. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and I'm probably not. So it is what it is. I don't speak Portuguese. It led him to conclude that all of the other groups of placental mammals evolved from those South American forms. He was so impressed, and of course, this made him an absolute hero. In South America, like, look at our paleontologist finding the very first horses and the first, rabbits and everything. So
Yeah, it turns out not so much, guys. Sorry.
Yep. That wasn't until later that as paleontology progressed, and researchers realized, no, these guys aren't. They're not closely related at all.
Turns out the first horses lived in North America, not South America.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And the first rhinos and the basic Parasitactyla evolved in North America. And then they all died out. Until the Spanish brought some of them back.
Yay! A comeback. I love a good comeback.
That's why there are feral horses not far from me. I see them not too infrequently.
Alrighty. Next slide, please. And so, more biogeography. This is a very interesting one. While Darwin was circumnavigated the world, and then came back to England and started his work. Well, first he started work on geology. He wrote a couple books on geology, and then he did his work on barnacles. And while he's doing all of this, and the ideas that would become evolution are meshing in his mind and evolving themselves, there's another guy who's also working on very similar ideas in a completely different part of the world. That is Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace really doesn't get much of the credit. We kind of mentioned him sort of in passing.
First.
That's true. He didn't publish first. He sent I think it was a letter to Darwin, who had become rather popular at that point for all the fossils he found in South America and the books he'd written on geology. And he was becoming quite a scientific celebrity. And Wallace is like, hey, I have these ideas. What do you think about this? And Darwin was like, oh, crap, I'm about to be scooped on this idea I've been working on for 20 years.
I should probably get it down and publish that book, huh?
Yep. And so he had, because Darwin did not like to go out and speak at conferences or anything like that. So he had, I think it was Huxley, read both Wallace's paper and Darwin's sort of preprint, his abstract on natural selection. And then immediately thereafter, Darwin got started on origin. He had plans for a larger book on natural selection, which never got finished apparently. But origin of species was the one that stuck, and Darwin is predominantly credited with natural selection. And so Wallace was working on similar ideas. He was also working in an archipelago, however you pronounce that. I don't know. I don't do words. Doesn't even make sense.
You know what? Just pronounce it the way you want to. Who cares?
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Here's a pro tip. The way that the dictionary gets their pronunciation guides is by listening to people say the word.
Mm-hmm.
And if everyone says it a new way, the dictionary updates.
Fair enough. You got me there. So biogeography the biogeography of this area, which is called Wallachia or Wallachia, however you want. I usually say Wallachia. Is you have the Asian fauna on one side of this line, Wallace's line, and then you have the Australian fauna on the other side. Now, why on earth would that be the case? Well, as it happens, Australia was part of Gondwana, the southern supercontinent during the Mesozoic, whereas Asia was part of Laurasia, the northern supercontinent. And so these continents were separated for a very long time, and now they're finally coming together, and the fauna is very different in both.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have your kangaroos and platypuses and wallabies and all that sort of stuff on one side, and Komodo dragons on the Australian side, and then elephants, tigers, monkeys, all those guys on the Asian side. Very different faunas. And then Aphrotheria, which is an order, one of the four super orders of placental mammals, and all these guys evolved in Africa. Africa was also an island for quite a while, as I mentioned earlier, and you have elephants and elephant shrews. I just love that elephant shrews are related to elephants. That's great, and they're not insectivores anymore, or in members of Insectivora.
And they were named elephant shrews before we knew that they were actually related to elephants.
Yeah, which is just wonderful. Fantastic.
Although I see we also have the precursor of the dolphin.
Gross.
Everybody.
You dare besmirch my PowerPoint presentation with David Peters.
Okay, this is a little bit of a side tangent, but David Peters owns a couple websites like Pterosaur Heresies and ReptileEvolution.com. Never use either of them for sources. They are completely bonkers about virtually everything, except I guess that some animals exist. He gets that right.
Yes, a few of them do in fact exist.
Yeah, but he has
bonkers.
Crazy ideas like dolphins are closer to elephants than they are to cows, which is not true.
Yeah, that they're the descendants of Tenrex.
Yeah,
he actually left that on a video I made way back. I don't think it wasn't the whale penis one. It was the misunderstanding whale transitional fossils video. Yeah, he left that comment, and I was like, "This is bonkers, sir. Please post more."
So, by the way, when I was at the Painted Desert Park with RJ and our friend Colton and our friend Aaron and the whole group of people, Benthoven, they made me try to read the paper about what was it? Oh my goodness. It was like something or Desmostylians or something. Hippos or Desmostylians or something like that.
Oh yeah, and those are the
couldn't-
descendants of whales, yeah.
Yeah,
Or
and
the
I
ancestors
couldn't
of whales, sorry.
I couldn't get through it. I just collapsed. I had to sit down. I was laughing too hard because of how stupid everything in S. Peters' quote unquote paper was. It all made no sense.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely terrible.
Like if you think Kent Hovind is bad at this, you
He's
should
like the
read some
Kent
David
Hovind
Peters.
of evolution, I guess you could say.
Basically. Basically. This is a guy who was told by a paleontologist, like, oh, hey, that thing that you're interpreting as like integument, that's a tool mark I made while preparing this fossil myself, personally. And David Peters was like, you don't know what you're talking about. It's like, but I made it. Like, no, part of the fossil. Okay, sure.
Yeah, he's
sure.
crazy. Don't listen to him.
No.
Other Aphrotheres include the Aardvark, which is that guy in the middle left.
Oh, yeah.
The Hyrax, bottom left. And Elephant Shrew, top right.
I'm getting
Tenrex.
slightly offended. You talk about me and
No, you're Peter, not Peters.
David Peters.
My
Peters.
bad.
He's multiple Peters.
My bad.
Yeah.
And then the Manatee.
And I know him as well.
I don't.
All
I
Peters know
believe
each other.
No, the manatee.
Just one.
Oh, okay. But where's the
so
dugong, Jackson?
Yep, sorry. No, actually, no. I think that is a dugong based on the tail.
Yeah, you're right. The
the
tail
tail
has looks like a
pointed.
dolphin tail and not like a round.
Yeah. So really,
Yeah.
that is probably a dugong.
It's a
But
very
the
fat
cool
dugong.
thing, I don't remember if we talked about this on my channel or yours, but we mentioned how the earliest elephants and the earliest Saurinians look very similar, have very similar niches, very similar gaits. Overall, just like Meratherium and like Pesosiren are like very similar to each other morphologically, which makes sense because they're the Saurinia and Proboscidea are sister clades.
groups. Yeah.
So,
Which is, and then surprise, surprise, the earliest members look almost identical, which is also the case when you look at like Rhinoceratidae and Equidae, which is the rhinos and the horses. The earliest rhinoceratids and the earliest equids are virtually indistinguishable. It actually takes experts in tooth morphology to distinguish them.
Yes. Yeah, it's like one has cross crests on its teeth and the other one doesn't. That's basically it.
There are people whose job it is to sort through teeth to figure out if they're horse or rhino teeth, because it's the only way they can tell which group a particular animal belongs to.
Yeah, we had Donald Prothero on this channel a couple times way back, and that was actually part of his work. Was in Nebraska, there's a big fossil site that is like a Oligocene, I think, and there's a big volcanic eruption which covered the whole area in ash and
Yeah,
suffocated lots of animals. I can't remember the name. Was it like White Hills or something like that?
Is it ashfall beds? Because that's another one, but I'm not sure if it's the same one. Because the ashfall beds, but that might not be in Nebraska.
Well, at any rate, look up Donald Prothero. I'm sure you'd find it.
That's homework for you guys back at home.
Next slide, please. Did it change?
It did.
Oh, there it goes. Okay, sorry. I don't know if my internet's slow.
Well, we know your internet is slow.
You're
not wrong.
I know you're not wrong. When nothing changed for a second, I was panicking because I thought my internet had dropped out. Anyway, actually, so back to the Isthmus of Panama, as we were talking about earlier. Okay, 3.5 million years ago, you had this one continuous population of porkfish. We actually have these guys at the aquarium where I work.
Nice. Which version?
The Virginicus.
Okay.
Because they're the common. They're the more common one in the aquaria. So, so you had this one continuous population, which was interbreeding in off the northern coast of South America, and then the Isthmus of Panama formed, and now you have a break, and both sides cannot interbreed with each other any longer. Mm-hmm. And as a result, you have speciation. They have novel adaptations, because I'm sure as a result of the Isthmus of Panama forming, you had like current changes, and the way that like warm and cold water distributed throughout the oceans would have changed drastically. So, so that would have caused novel adaptations in these different fish as a result, and now they're different species. This is also true of lots of different, I think, like mantis shrimp, and there's some urchins and stuff. The various marine organisms which live around on both sides of the Isthmus of Panama are typically pretty closely related to each other. There'll be like sister species, and that, again, doesn't make any sense at all unless it was a continuous population until the Isthmus of Panama formed.
Right.
And that requires old Earth and evolution. So,
because if the isthmus had been there for a very long time and organisms had to spread for millions of years, or even just since their inception with the isthmus there, you would expect that the closest relatives on either side would actually be north or south on the same side. So the closest relatives of, the eastern porkfish, I'll say, would probably be in like the Gulf of Mexico or on the east coast of South America. But nope, opposite side of the isthmus, which means couldn't have formed that long ago in terms of geology, in terms of, the history of evolution of life on Earth.
Right, absolutely. And then just another paper on Laurasiathera biogeography. I talked about this in a bat video, because it's really hard to see, but that chart refers to bats. So the yellow ones over there, those are the different other Laurasiathera groups. But bats also started out in so basically all Laurasiatheras started out in North America and then spread from there, including bats. And you can see that the phylogeny of bats is correlated with different continents. So that's pretty cool. That's called phylogeography, where you trace the phylogeny of a group of some clade across an area. It's a really cool field, and it is becoming increasingly well studied because we're getting increasing amounts of data. So you get some really neat patterns showing up.
You can also do that within a single species, which is one of the ways that we know that
slide,
humans originated in Africa and not, say, the Middle East.
Absolutely right, because humans did not originate in the Middle East. They absolutely originated in Africa. And the evidence on that is pretty darn clear. So,
yep.
Okay. Now we've talked about natural selection for an hour and a half. So let's talk about sexual selection. We are probably not going to finish this part of or we're not going to get as far as I thought we would, which is okay.
More parts.
That means That means we'll just be back next week. Okay, sexual selection. This was also an idea that Darwin formalized. I'm not going to say he came up with it per se. I'll say he formalized it because I don't know if it's technically true that he came up with it. But the basic idea behind sexual selection is we talked about intra-specific competition previously when we first started talking about natural selection, and that's organisms within a population, so members of the same species competing for some resource. And in this case, it's mates. So these are what are called sexually dimorphic animals. And sexual dimorphism refers to the differences between the sexes. So in deer, for instance, you have these males, obviously, and they have these big antlers, but the females don't have big antlers. Or in the case of elephant seals, they are huge, and I think that's a female in the foreground.
Yes,
but
those
you can
are,
see the males
those are
are
adult females in the foreground.
Yeah, those are adult females compared to the adult males. Just look at how much bigger the adult males are. It's bonkers how much bigger they are.
Yeah.
And the reason for this, as Darwin noted, and it's been noted ever since, is organisms that have very high sexual dimorphism, so the males and females are very different, tend to be polygamous. They tend to be polygamous. They tend to be one male mates with a bunch of females, which
A
is also
harem,
called
if you will.
right. That's also called a polygyny, which is the more precise term. And so basically, the males will battle. This is what Darwin called the law of battle. And in my opinion, it's the less interesting of the types of sexual selection. We'll get to the more interesting one in a moment. But in essence, the males fight for the females, and whoever the winner is gets to pass on their genes. The loser does not. So sad. Anything you'd like to add?
Well, sometimes the loser then goes and decides to be a sneaky male, where they basically hang out at the edges of the harem and opportunistically mate, sometimes, in the case of elephant seals, by bribing females with food. So it's not like you completely selected against. You got a shot, but it's not very good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, and also this is the other major force behind why organisms have armaments. It's not all just natural selection, so they're not always just protected from predators. Also, a lot of times armaments evolve for a male-male competition.
Yeah. Actually, with the deer, that's a good example, because deer only grow antlers when it's mating season, basically. There are some species that have year-round and even both sexes, but most deer only grow antlers during mating season and then shed them because they don't need them outside of mating season. They're not using them for defense against wolves and bears. They're using them for mate competition.
Right. Exactly. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. All right. This is, in my opinion, the more interesting type of sexual selection. And this form also has a very interesting history. So female mate choice is kind of the opposite of sort of in a sort of way, it's kind of the opposite, because with the law of battle, the males are fighting each other, and to the victor goes the spoils. But in this case, the males they still have to compete with each other, but typically non-violently, because they don't want to damage their goods, basically, so they can advertise to females. They're competing, but in a non-violent way. They want the female to pick them. Whoever has the prettiest feathers, in the case of the great Argus pheasant, or whoever can dance the best. That's what lecking is. That these blue mannequins, you can see the female. She's kind of hard to see, but she's like kind of green and gray. Whereas those are all males, all those blue guys, and they perform this very acrobatic dance to impress her. And if you really want to know more about the female mate choice, I highly recommend the book "The Evolution of Beauty" by Richard Prum. He's an ornithologist. It's a real good book. He also has no time for evolutionary psychology, which I also appreciate. So, but the history about it. So Darwin was attuned to female mate choice. He included this in The Descent of Man, and Selection in Relation to Sex. That was his other really big book. That was where he formalized sexual selection, and also really delivered the hammering blow on how humans are definitely primates and share common ancestry with other apes. And the cool thing about that idea was that was kind of progressive for his time. The idea that females are choosing males, and it was so progressive, in fact, that Wallace, he was very opposed to the idea. He was more Darwinian in a sense than Darwin was. He was like, no, everything's natural selection, female mate choice. I mean, law of battle, sure, I'll agree to that. Whatever, fine. Males can fight over females, but the females are not actively choosing their mates. That just doesn't. Females can't do that. That doesn't sound real. And so
I feel like he'd never been to a club.
well, it was the mid 1800s, so maybe
That's probably true.
Just
yeah.
a gentleman's club.
Yeah. Right. Probably true. No ladies' night at the gentleman's club.
Women aren't allowed to be out of the house.
Well, that's never been true. You couldn't actually have a functioning society where they just weren't ever allowed out.
I know. But female mate choice was, unfortunately, because Darwin died before Wallace did, and Wallace and Huxley kind of became the main spokespeople for evolution, and both of them weren't really on board with female mate choice. So the idea kind of languished until like the 60s or 70s, because interestingly, science is often influenced by social events. And as it happens, in the 60s was the sexual revolution. And this also triggered a sort of reform in some ways of looking at how organisms do sex. And female mate choice made a comeback in that time period as a result. And now today it's pretty much it's
I don't think it's disputed really at all.
It's not disputed. Yeah, it's kind of a non-argument at this point. Everybody's really on board with it now. So science isn't always about ivory towers and being totally disconnected from the world around you. Sometimes there is some cultural influence. That doesn't mean any of the conclusions are subjective or relative or something like that. That just means there is some input, in both directions, which is a good thing. So, anything to add on this point?
No, I think I added as much as I wanted to.
Okay. Next slide, please. And here we have a couple examples of some very extreme sexual dimorphism. You have the anglerfish, Linophrene arborifera, and so that's the female. I think it's ceratioide is the name of the clade of anglerfish, where the females are really large and the males are basically parasites on the female.
I was going to say that male is about as developed as they get. They then get less developed, because what they do is they find a female. Once they grow to this ridiculously small size, their goal in life is to find a female. Then they bite onto her, and then they sort of merge with her, and their
essentially
circulatory systems combine, and then pretty much everything except the testes of the male just kind of just rots away. Not rots away, but it sort of
doesn't function,
goes away. Yeah,
as much as it used to.
Yeah, basically, even the nervous system just kind of goes away eventually. So the male is now basically just a genetically distinct set of testes that the female can use to fertilize eggs. And any given female can have several males attached. So she, got a whole bunch of extra pairs of balls just hanging out.
That's exactly right. And it was interesting because for a while, researchers could not figure out where the male anglerfish were. It's like, every anglerfish they pull up is a female. And they're like, how could this be? Where are the males? Well, it turns out they were there the whole time.
Right, on the female.
We were just looking in the wrong spot.
Yep. Actually, I have a fun thing with the orb weavers. I was in South Carolina with some family a few years ago. And shortly before my nephew decided to run towards a very large alligator, where we had to restrain him to say, no, please do not get eaten by this prehistoric monster, we were looking at some orb weavers. And there was a male orb weaver approaching a female orb weaver. And so I made the comment that, see, that's the boy spider. Refused to believe that the male and female spiders could be this different. Like, nope, he just didn't believe me. And I was like, all right, well, I mean, you don't have to. But yeah,
I mean,
it was completely, went against all of his intuition.
Yeah, I mean, they're tiny, and essentially
And
what happens is
female
the
orb weavers are
males,
gigantic.
yeah, they're crazy big.
That animal that you're seeing there, the female, it's probably bigger than your hand.
Yes, yeah, that's not. Yeah, that's smaller than life size, believe it or not.
Well, depending on the screen you're watching it on.
Yeah, you're probably right. Seeing it on mine, it's smaller than my hand. But anyway, so the male basically what he has to do is he takes his little spermatophore, which is a packet of sperm, because arachnids are weird.
Mm-hmm.
They basically lost the ability. They lost the swimming sperm, which is why if horseshoe crabs are in fact sister to hooded ticks, it's going to be real weird trying to explain how that reversion came about, which is why I don't think it happened. But I think their phylogeny is probably
I
wrong.
press X to doubt on hooded ticks being the sister group to Xyphosura.
Yeah. So because hooded ticks, just like all other arachnids, have sperm packets. They have spermatophore. Mm-hmm. So the male basically has to sneak up on the female and insert his little spermatophore without getting eaten, at least before he does it.
Right.
She can eat him as soon as he does it, and he's already accomplished his evolutionary goal. So, but yeah, I just imagine he's got his friends watching on a branch nearby, and they're like, "Careful, Jeffrey! Careful, Jeffrey! Careful, Jeffrey! He did it! Oh, she got him." Yeah.
But he did it though.
He did it though. Yeah.
You can die happy.
Next slide, please. All right, and just like natural selection, we can test sexual selection. We can test, in fact, all of the evolutionary mechanisms. Crazy. This is a very famous experiment which was done back in the 80s by, I think, John Endler was his name. So he took guppies, which were from Trinidad. He took these guppies and made...
But not Tobago.
Right. Yep. And he released them into these ponds. And what he found was in ponds where there were no predators, he just had the little killifish, the guppies became progressively brighter. They had these blue, shiny spots on their sides, and those got brighter over the generations. Well, he also made ponds with these guppies, but also added the pike cichlid, Crinocycla alta. And what happened there was the guppies became less and less colorful. So you had sexual selection operating in the no predator environment, but natural selection overpowered the sexual selection in the predator pond, which is pretty darn cool. Yeah, this evolutionary trade-off, because you want to attract mates, but you also don't want to get ate.
Yeah, it's always a balance act, right? And that's actually part of the reason that sexual selection works in some species, because it can be a indirect signal of ability to survive, right? So male peacocks, well, I was going to say male peacocks, but all peacocks are male because the other ones are peahen and the species
right.
is peafowl.
Right.
Anyway, people don't know that. So peacocks, like that ridiculous tail is a hindrance. But if you've got, if you're healthy enough and you got good enough genetics to survive despite that weird handicap, well, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the technical name for that is Zahavi's principle. And there's like math to back it up.
Math.
Because I mean, it's, at the core of it, a lot of evolution or a lot of biology generally is like math based. And, we've talked about population genetics in the last video, which is essentially these different guys in the 30s came up with the math for how natural selection works, right? What is the rate at which a mutation which has a certain selective advantage spreads through the population given a certain amount of selective pressure? How long would that take? And in the 30s, Ronald Fisher, Sewell Wright, JBS Haldane, and other guys like that, they figured that out. And
Also, that's why there's a unit of measurement called the Darwin.
yeah, what is it? A 10% change per million years? Isn't that what it is?
So I don't
Or is it
remember.
1% change per million years?
I think actually a Darwin is a fixation per generation, and nothing actually gets up to a Darwin. Things are measured in millidarwins usually.
Okay, maybe that's what it is. Yeah. Anyway, it's the Darwin exists.
It's a
And
unit of measurement.
people who do like rates of evolution stuff, like I always forget his name, George Gaylord Simpson and like Gould. People who do that sort of stuff use Darwin's, but most biologists don't, so you probably won't see it used very often. But at any rate, all right, next slide, please. Another test of sexual selection. So this is sort of along the same lines as the Zahavi principle, the hindrance hypothesis, if we want to be alliterative.
By the way, one Darwin is defined as an E-fold change in a trait over 1 million years. Haldane named the unit after Charles Darwin, which is a 0.2718 roughly change, because E,
Okay.
the natural number, which is a
Bizarre.
weird unit, but whatever.
Yeah, seems like a very arbitrary unit, but whatever.
Well, look,
Fine.
my guess is that somewhere in the math, the natural number came up a whole bunch, and so it became a handy thing to use as a unit.
Sure.
Because it came, because the natural number is it's one of those weird numbers, sort of like pi. It just shows up places, and you're just like, okay, sure, we'll use it.
Right. Isn't that like how in banking, like the number 72 shows up a lot or something like that?
Yeah, or there's Pareto distributions where if you have a random sample of like it comes up with all sorts of stuff like 80% of money is owned by about 20% of people. The same thing is basically true for like land, like private land ownership tends to be about 80% of land is owned by about 20%. But even then within that, like of the 20% of money the 20% of people who are left with that money, of their money, 80% of it is owned by 20% of them. And so like, yeah, there's all sorts of places.
All the way down.
Yeah, there's all sorts of places where weird things like that, like normal distributions come up all the time too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just one of those things where like the natural world, it likes certain things in math, like Pareto distributions, the natural number, normal distributions, the golden ratio, all that stuff. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yep. All that fun mathy stuff.
But this isn't a math channel. It's a biology
So
channel.
this is sort of in that same vein where you have a feature. I mean, we've done some math for the Ancestors Tale videos. We've been doing a little bit of math in those.
That's true. We gotta get actual selection,
regardless.
So that way we can get to part 3 of 40 next time. Oh, 3 of 42. My bad.
Right? Yeah, I can't forget it. The other two.
I'm rounding.
So this frog, Hyla versicolor, the North American gray tree frog, they give off calls as frogs typically do. Except I have Hymenocyrus frogs, and I have looked at them. I've like watched them, and they open their little mouths and they jiggle like they're making noise, but they make no noise unless it's. I mean, it's maybe on my scale, it's just so high pitched I can't hear it, but the other frogs in the tank can, which I think is probably what's happening. But
yeah, there's
at any rate, these guys. So their call duration. So the longer they can call, it turns out that the better their genotype is. And so there's this really interesting correlation with these that these researchers found. But of course, your call can only go so long, because otherwise you run out of air, or maybe it's really bad on your vocal cords to make very the calls required to attract females or what have you. So there's a limit to how long your call can be. But the males who are in that upper range tend on average to have higher genetic quality than other males. Alrighty, next pulls. And here's another, and this is in fact testing pretty much directly the idea for like the peacocks, but these are widow birds. So researchers cut off the tails, and it's just feathers. It's not their
Yeah,
actual
just tail
folks.
feathers, right?
Their tail feathers. And they attached those feathers to other males, and the females were more attracted to males who had these ridiculously long tail feathers than the males who did not.
Man, it's got to be a rough time to be in the first group.
Right? Like,
oof, come on, man.
what?
How you
Why
gonna
did you
me
do
like that?
this? Why did I do to you? You know. And so this is
Sorry,
also
guys.
in support of that whole, the birds of the Zahavi principle. The birds who can keep a long tail and can also escape predators are, more likely, or they have a more fit genotype than males who can't. Obviously, because they get weeded out of the gene pool by predators.
Mm-hmm.
So,
There
because
was also something similar done with swordfish, because there are some groups of swordfish that don't really have a sword appendage on their nose, but they attached prosthetic swords to the males of some species, and they found that the females preferentially mated with long-sworded males, even in species that typically didn't have a sword appendage.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a pretty cool study, because it's it's kind of theoretical to say something like the peacocks have these tails, and it must, the females must pick them because they survive, whereas the other males don't, or whatever. But here we can actually test this hypothesis. You can directly test this idea. So it's not just hypotheticals. It's not just in the abstract. We can actually show that this is most likely to be the case. Right. Next slide, please. Okay, actually, well, no, we've only got 10 minutes left.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dapper.
Real quick, it is true that there is the swordfish, which is Xiphias gladius, and I was using swordfish as sort of a shorthand for Xiphidae.
Broadly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I knew what you meant. And I'm sure the audience did.
Well, it came up in chat, so I want to point out that I was technically, it was not correct for me to say swordfish. I should have said Xiphidae. I
think we have 20 minutes because we started like 11 minutes late, I believe. So,
I mean, if you want to go into genetic drift, I'm not sure.
Let's do it. I think we only have one slide on, anyways, because
it's only one slide. Then yeah, let's do it.
I mean, it's kind of a difficult concept to get one's head around, anyways. So I was like, I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty of it. I'll just sort of the broad strokes. Okay, so we are no longer talking about selection. Okay, folks, natural selection, we were predominantly concerned with beneficial and detrimental alleles. The detrimental alleles are more likely to be weeded out, and the beneficial alleles are more likely to increase in frequency within the population. Now we are talking about neutral alleles, neutral changes, neutral mutations.
Mm-hmm.
And so these, because they are not subject to any sort of selective pressure, either natural or sexual selection, these can fluctuate at random within the population. Your parents may or may not have had some particular mutation, and it didn't affect their genotype or their phenotype at all, and it won't affect yours at all, and it probably won't affect your offspring at all. And so as a result, just as a result of mating and passing on certain combinations of alleles, these will fluctuate at random throughout the population. But they have the potential to be selected. If you have some allele, and we talked about this previously with regard to bacteria and the evolution of antibiotic resistance, because all of the point mutations are already sampled in the population, all of them. But what that means is, should the environment change, some of those point mutations, which were previously neutral, are likely to be beneficial, and some are likely to be detrimental. And now those which are beneficial are being selected for, and those which are detrimental are being selected against. And maybe some mutations that were originally beneficial or harmful are now neutral. They no longer have any bearing on whether or not you survive.
Yeah.
Would you like to add anything?
Well, so one thing I want to say is that this gets into an important thing that's often misunderstood, which is neutral theory, which was really kind of proposed and fleshed out by the researcher Moto Kimura, who you might be able to guess is Japanese.
Mhm.
Or, sorry, was Japanese. I believe he's now deceased for quite a while.
Yeah, probably. He was doing work in like the late 60s, early 70s, so yeah.
Yes. Although, speaking of Japan and scientists, turns out that the Emperor of Japan is actually a well-respected scientist with many, many papers. So there you go. Yeah, that's actually what he does with his time because he doesn't have to run anything. So he does science.
Fair enough. I mean, why not?
Anyway, so Moto Kimura was interested in what was called neutral evolution, which was evolution that isn't selected for. And so he came up with a lot of the mathematical models that we now use to understand how genetic drift and neutral variation and things like that change over time. And it's really cool because neutral variation gives you a sort of a clear look at ancestry. Because if you look at something that has some kind of selection or sexual constraint on it, then it might not mutate as much as you would expect, or mutations might be weeded. Well, no, it'll mutate as much as you expect, but mutations won't be fixed very often because it's under a higher amount of constraint. So, for instance, if you look at, say, I don't know, like hemoglobin between, say, the great apes, well, hemoglobin's a pretty important protein. You can't really break it, or it's a really bad time. So you're going to get a relatively low number of differences in there, not necessarily because of relation, but because of selection. Whereas if you look at, say, intergenic regions, which are usually just there as spacers, and what's actually in there doesn't matter much, you can actually see this consistent accumulation of mutation over time. And so one of the interesting predictions that you get from evolution, but that you would not get from any other explanation of biodiversity, is that neutral mutations should also form a strongly nested hierarchy, even in cases where areas of the genome under selection might not give you as strong a signal. And that's, in fact, what we find, which is, it's hard to explain that by any mechanism other than evolution.
Yes, to shout out Dan Stern Cardinal, he did a video a little while back, and I do not remember the name, so just go check out his channel in general. He makes very good videos, where he talked about that. He talked about specific predictions of separate versus common ancestry. And so regions not... And so, yeah, basically as Dapper said. So
yeah, it's very cool. Also, Moto Kimura is often misused because in his mathematical models, he excluded beneficial mutations because they would tend to support his numbers. And he's been then falsely claimed to have said that there just weren't any, or there were so few that they basically didn't matter. When in fact, it was quite the opposite. There were so many, and they were selected for so quickly and so strongly that he had to just pretend they didn't exist in order to get his math to work.
Yep, and some people apparently cannot read and cannot seem to understand that fact. But whatever.
Well, I think some people deliberately don't understand that fact.
That's probably true. That is probably the case. I guess the other thing which we could mention is that there was this whole debate kind of back in the 70s and 80s about, it was called selectionism versus neutralism. And it was a big misunderstanding. The Kimura never proposed that that selection didn't happen.
Right.
The issue was that selection would overpower, the changes that are occurring neutrally, and so he had to exclude those from, as you said, from his calculations. But other people, scientists even, took that to mean selection just doesn't happen.
Right.
And there were people for and against that idea. They were like, oh no, most evolutionary changes are just neutral, blah, blah, blah. And it was just a complete misunderstanding of Kimura's work. And I'm really glad we are now past that debate because it was dumb. There was no point for it. So, all right. Next slide, please. All right. I guess we'll get into speciation here in the next for the next 10 minutes. We'll just talk about it. So speciation. So this is the process of one species becoming two. I know, crazy world. And a species, well, in the Mayer species concept is a reproductively viable population, and that, broadly work. Well, in fact, the first example here shows that it doesn't really quite work, but
yeah.
But But
It's an
regardless,
okay
so
it's an okay thing as a beginning understanding of what a species
yes,
might be in many groups of organisms, but when you get down to the nitty gritty of actual biology and like no, it kind of falls apart.
there was a meme I saw on Twitter that said, in elementary school doesn't know what a species is. In high school knows what a species is. In college doesn't know what a species is. And I really appreciate that meme.
Well, I mean, it's true. It's also
Yeah.
the case for like history, right? Like you go to elementary school and you're like, oh, okay, so this was the cause of this war. Then you get to high school and you're like, well, it's a little bit more complicated. And then you get to college and they're just like, you think that was the cause of the war? Hold on.
You have to go through these manuscripts by this dude before you can even begin to think about the causes of this war.
Dude, I spent a fair bit of time in the Boston Public Library's Department of Rare Books and Manuscripts looking up handwritten letters from the 60s.
Yeah, exactly. So
It's a thing.
so speciation. So these examples, so we have one observed example and one they're both observed, one natural example and one artificially induced example. So the natural example is Procambarus virginalis, which is the unfortunate little crawfish on his back, or on her back, sorry, because the one on top is a male Procambarus phallax attempting to mate with the virginalis and is not succeeding. It does not work.
He might not know that.
He almost certainly doesn't know that, or maybe he does and he's just having a good time. Who knows? Regardless, Procambarus phallax, or an individual, had a gamete that experienced a whole genome duplication. This occurred back in the 90s because researchers, going back to phylogeography, researchers can trace like where and when pretty much exactly this happened using the genetics of this species. And so this individual had offspring, but the offspring were triploids rather than diploids. That means instead of having two copies or two sets of chromosomes, two complements, they had 3 sets of chromosomes. But this also, as a result, made them asexual. They reproduce asexually now, basically by cloning themselves instead of sexually, which is normal for crawfish. And so this new species, this asexual species, got released into the environment at some point. So pet owners, don't release your species into the environment, please, because they're invasive. And they're taking over waterways in Europe now and outcompeting the native crawfish, because it's much easier to just clone yourself than find a partner to mate with.
In the short term, yeah.
Yeah, unless, like some kind of parasite comes along, then they're probably screwed. But
In the long term, Procambarus virginalis is probably not going to be the progenitor of like the next big thing in crawfish. However, for the time being, it's actually a pretty big problem in a lot of areas in the world.
Right, exactly. So that is, that's a human time scale. Dapper was around in the 90s and also 90 million years ago. So.
Right, I was going to say, I mean, if you're going to use me as the time scale, then a lot of speciation is viable. But...
Okay, I think it was early 90s, so I wasn't quite there yet. It was just slightly before Jackson. But still, that's, observable human timescales. I guarantee a fair bit of our audience was alive, and possibly
you missed out on the height of flannel. I'm sorry.
Darn shucks.
Yeah.
What a shame.
And baggy pants, man. And no sleeve flannel baggy pants, the height of the 90s.
And the other one, this will be it. We'll close out after we explain this as well. Is this, these guys are, I realized I didn't put the name in there. This is Drosophila pseudo-obscura. That's the name of that fruit fly.
They're not really obscura. They're just a little bit obscura.
Exactly. Actually, okay, well, fun thing I'll tell you about this paper in a moment. So these researchers took this fruit fly, the pseudo-obscura, and they reared it on different types of food, one on a starch medium and one on a sucrose medium. And they raised these guys for a couple generations. And after a few generations, they tried to have the fruit flies, or these fruit flies, interbreed the starch and the sucrose populations, and they did not interbreed. They wanted nothing to do with each other. And at the time, the researchers could not figure out how this was the case. It was way too short of a time scale for them to have like genetically diverged, right? Because I don't think it was that many generations. And it turns out researchers figured out later that it was their gut bacterium. Because these populations are being raised on these different food sources, their gut bacteria are giving off different metabolites as a result. And this is causing the fruit flies to basically only seek out other fruit flies who also have gut bacteria displaying these metabolites, because they get incorporated into the fruit fly system and they're, displaying it, in some way outwardly. And so there's speciation, but due to a novel food source, right? You have genetic speciation in the Procambarus example, and then sort of an ecological, morphological speciation on the
There's
right.
also behavioral. For instance, I wish I remember the species, but there's a group of flies in the United States, and I believe they're actually called apple flies or something.
The apple flies.
Yeah. And so the thing is, apples are not native to North America. They were brought by European colonists. And so the original population of these flies didn't actually... So these flies parasitize fruit. They lay their eggs in fruit, and then the larvae eat the fruit. That's why if you've ever been like apple picking, sometimes there's a hole in there, and if you were to cut that apple open, you would find a worm. It's a grub. It's a maggot basically for these apple flies. But the ones that still feed on native plants have a different timing for when they mate than the ones that feed typically on apples, because apples have a different time when they're basically when you should be laying your eggs on. I think if they actually lay them on the flower, that becomes the apple.
I think you're right. Yeah.
But because of this, those two populations, despite the fact that they're genetically almost identical, don't interbreed anymore because they're breeding at different times. And so genetically, they're compatible. There's no particular reason to think they wouldn't find each other attractive as mates. But because they're not mating at the same time, they're on their way to just becoming completely distinct species.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we are going to cut it at this point because we're getting pretty close to the 2-hour mark. So for the next one, I'm pretty sure the only things left are the remainder of our talk on speciation and then the evidence that evolution has been occurring in the past. I mean, aside from the evidence we've already presented, like the biogeographic evidence, that sort of stuff. Yeah. Aside from that, we will discuss, we'll discuss genetics and the fossils and all that sort of stuff. So, so there's that. All right, Dapper, what's going on your channel in the near future?
Let's see. So, not tomorrow, but Saturday, we have part 3 of the Giant of North America, where myself and Vishanti are taking a look at the weird and fairly racist conspiracy theories concerning the idea that North America once was ruled by a race of superhuman giants, because it basically comes down to people don't think Native Americans could build impressive structures.
What's the meme? Just because white people didn't do it doesn't mean it was aliens.
Right. Or giants in this case.
Right, yeah.
So yeah, it basically just comes down to, Native Americans couldn't build giant mounds out of dirt, which, why? That's never well explained. They just couldn't, trust me.
They couldn't put dirt on dirt. Trust me, bro.
It had to be giants with a double row of teeth. Yeah.
Amazing.
Which actually reminds me, I heard the argument not that long ago that you could tell that Og, a king in the Bible, was a giant because his bed was 13 feet long. And I was like, I could think of some other reasons why he might have a giant bed as a Bronze Age king.
Maybe
just a hypothetical. A couple reasons, maybe. I don't know. So that's Saturday. Tuesday, Jackson. We're hanging out again on Tuesday.
We are hanging out again.
We're doing Jackson with Jackson. What is it, 7 or something? 6, 7?
It's been enough that my mental health has deteriorated in the meantime.
Well, that's because you don't bring enough alcohol, man. Just make sure you don't remember it the next day, and then everything's fine.
I guess that's true.
There's a reason I do it.
Oh, speaking of, Dan Stern Cardinal had Dr. Charles Jackson on today.
He did.
I have not watched that yet, but I definitely intend to.
I have. It was a fun conversation. It was a little on the infuriating side, and Dr. Charles Jackson interrupted far too much, but that's okay. So let's see. That was Tuesday the 22nd. Thursday the 24th should be actually the first part of my 2-part Kurt Wise series called Kurt Unwise, in which he tells us that you're a coward if you think that pronghorn are neither antelope nor deer.
That's just something. That's a whole
Yeah.
claim right there.
Saying that they're their own thing and more closely related to giraffes than to deer or antelope is just cowardice, apparently, for some reason. I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me, but yeah, that's the stance he decided to go with. It was like, yeah, taking seriously the idea that Giraffeoidea exists is cowardice.
That's amazing. I love it.
Bovinae or Cervidae are the only kind of pecorin artiodactyls that exist.
Get out of here,
no.
other
Mosquidae? No,
artiodactyls?
absolutely not. Mosquidae does not exist.
Not in
Those
my
are Mosquideer, by the way.
not in my phylogeny.
That's as far ahead as I really want to look right now because I have other things. As you guys might know, if you like join my channel or Patreon, you have access to like 8 videos that haven't come out yet.
That's a lot. That's a lot of
Yeah.
videos.
So I've been trying to get ahead because weeks like this week where I've had things like, trips to hospitals and things like that have that comes up sometimes, and I don't want to have to just fall behind simply because I had stuff to do.
Those are substantially less fun.
Well, it wasn't too bad for me. I wasn't the one who was a patient, so.
Okay. Well, I hope that. Wait, hold on. You went to a hospital, not a vet clinic? Didn't know.
Well, right, the patient was a human. I was not the patient.
Oh, I thought you said I was the. Oh, sorry.
No, I was not the patient.
My
The
bad.
patient
Okay.
was human.
Yeah, I got you. Okay. All right. Okay. Indeed, still not fun. But, well, thank you for coming on as always, and thank you everyone in the audience for watching, and thank you Peter for hosting as always.
You're
Our
welcome.
Lord and Savior.
Can I also butt in a little bit about something that
Absolutely.
Dapper mentioned earlier? I want to apologize
Yes.
to the entire atheist community in general, and to both you and Dapper specifically for the whole giant thing. Because when I started learning Photoshop, I joined this forum called Worth 500. And what they would do to pretty much push people to do more in Photoshop, they would hold contests. One of the contests was scientists unearthing a giant skeleton. The guy who won made 2 pictures. One overall picture, and then zooming in on that particular picture, which is the archaeologist next to a giant skull, which is part of a giant skeleton. That is the number one picture used by young Earth creationists who think that there were giants in the earth, as the Bible said.
And you made it?
No. A friend of mine made it. I wasn't nearly as good as any of the people who contributed back then. I just joined.
I was fully ready for you to be like, and I made it.
No. I can't take credit for something that I didn't make. I wish I had. I wish I would have contributed to that, or could have contributed to that thing, because I think anywhere between 60 and 90% of the pictures used by young Earth creationists come from that particular thing, from that contest.
That is not surprising.
The forum doesn't exist anymore, so there is it was bought up, and then parts of it were released. I'm not sure if the contest that I'm talking about is available still on the internet, but yeah. If you do a reverse search on those images, 9 out of 10 times you will see in the bottom Worth 500. That means that it came from that contest.
I am not at all surprised
That's
that
great.
that has been the thing that has bamboozled
Yeah.
the recreationists.
To be fair,
Next
those
thing you know, they're going
Yeah,
to be telling us
not,
that
not
Slender Man
super.
is one of the Nephilim.
to be fair, those pictures were pretty convincing.
Don't give them any ideas, Dapper.
Oh, yeah. You know what? They don't need me for ideas. They come up with their own crazy ideas.
I just was on Twitter and I
Alrighty.
by accident I clicked on it, so the sound may have been heard here as well. Someone was
No, I didn't hear anything.
some no, you couldn't hear it, but maybe the people did.
Oh.
Someone was
I
asking
don't think I heard it either.
asking for me to make an intro, and then told me that I had to film that because it wouldn't be convincing. And I made a moon landing, sent that to Buzz Aldrin. He thought it was convincing, so I tweeted that as well. So yeah, some things can be convincing. It's still not real.
All right. Well, I gotta go before my internet drops off because it sounds like it's starting to rain outside. So
Okay, I'll take us out.
thank you everyone for coming. I think my internet's gone.
Oh, you're here.
I still hear
Okay.
you,
All right.
Jackson.
Well, thank you everyone for watching. Peter, play us out.
Okay.
I just want to take a moment to thank all my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovand, Denny5252, Ian Chen, John Ackerman, Chris Love, Landon Knoll, Sphincter of Doom, Star Runner, and Patrick Dennis. It's because of my channel members and patrons that this channel can keep on going at the blistering pace of 2 to 3 and almost always 3 uploads per week. And because I do run this channel at a slight loss, it is very important that anyone who can afford to and really likes my content, please do consider joining the Patreon or joining the channel with the link below. Patreon link is in the description. On Patreon, you can join at a 10% discount if you join for an annual subscription. And if for some reason you can't afford it, or an annual or monthly pledge isn't for you, there are always other ways to help out the channel. There's an Amazon wishlist linked in the description. There's also a merch store full of almost everything that Teespring makes.